Empires didn't just conquer land, they changed everything. Cities fell. Flags changed. New rulers took control. But what happened after the conquest is a story rarely told. Because for those living in conquered lands, victory didn't feel like victory. It felt like uncertainty. New laws, new power, new fear. Everything familiar, suddenly gone. What empires brought wasn't just control. It was a completely new reality. And for many, came at a cost they never chose. The battle ends. The noise fades. And for a brief moment, everything is still. But for the people living in that land, this is not the end. It's the beginning of something unknown. Conquering armies move through the streets, not as temporary visitors, but as the new authority. Their presence changes the atmosphere instantly. What once felt familiar now feels uncertain. Homes remain standing. Markets still exist. But something has shifted. Power. The people who once made decisions are no longer in control. New figures take their place. New rules begin to form, sometimes immediately, sometimes gradually. For civilians, the biggest challenge isn't survival in battle. It's what comes after. Understanding how to live under a new system. Learning what is expected. What is allowed. What is no longer acceptable. There are no clear instructions. No guide for what happens next. Only observation. People watch carefully. They listen. They adapt. Because in moments like this, survival depends on how quickly you understand the new reality. Some hope life will return to normal. But normal has already changed. Because conquest doesn't just redraw borders. It reshapes everyday life. And for those living through it, the hardest part isn't what was lost in battle. It's what comes after, when everything familiar is replaced by something unknown. After the conquest, change didn't always arrive all at once. Sometimes, it came quietly. At first, daily life continued. Markets opened. People worked. Streets filled again. But beneath that surface, something deeper was shifting. New authority began to take shape. Orders were given. Systems were introduced. And slowly, the rules that once defined life began to disappear. For the people living there, the challenge wasn't just understanding the new laws. It was predicting them. What was allowed yesterday might not be allowed tomorrow. What felt safe suddenly wasn't. So people adapted. Carefully, quietly. They watched how others behaved. They listened to how soldiers spoke. They learned through observation because mistakes could carry consequences. Language could change. Traditions could be restricted. Even small aspects of daily life, how people dressed, spoke, or gathered, could come under control. For some, these changes brought opportunity. New connections, new trade, new positions within the system. But for many others, it meant living with constant uncertainty. Because the rules weren't just about order, they were about control. And control wasn't always visible. Sometimes it was subtle. A presence in the streets. A silence in conversations. A hesitation before speaking freely. Over time, people began to adjust. Not because they accepted the change, but because they had to. Because survival wasn't about resistance. It was about understanding the system and learning how to live within it, even if it meant leaving parts of the past behind. As time passed, the changes became harder to ignore. What once felt temporary became permanent. Daily life in conquered lands began to revolve around the new authority. Not always through force, but through presence. A constant reminder that power had shifted, and that it wasn't shifting back anytime soon. People adjusted their routines. They spoke more carefully, gathered more quietly, watched their surroundings with a new awareness. Because control didn't always come through visible actions. Sometimes, it came through expectation. Knowing what could happen was often enough. Communities that once felt open and familiar started to change. Conversations became shorter. Trust became more limited. People weren't always sure who was listening, or who might report what was said. And slowly, life became more cautious. For many, identity itself began to shift. Traditions were practiced less openly. Customs were adapted or hidden. not because people wanted to forget, but because they needed to protect what remained. Some individuals found ways to fit into the new system. They adapted quickly, learned the rules, and navigated the structure to their advantage. Others struggled, because adapting didn't mean accepting. It meant surviving, and survival often came at a cost that wasn't always visible from the outside. Because while the streets looked active, and the markets seemed busy, there was something unspoken beneath it all. A quiet understanding that life was no longer fully their own, and that everything they did was now being lived under someone else's control. Control was never absolute. No matter how strong an empire became, there were always those who resisted. But resistance didn't always look like open rebellion. In conquered lands, it was often quiet, careful, hidden in everyday actions that seemed insignificant on the surface, but carried deeper meaning beneath. Some held onto their traditions in private, practicing customs behind closed doors, passing down language, stories, and beliefs quietly from one generation to the next. Others resisted through small acts of defiance, refusing to fully adopt new rules, slowing down work, sharing information in secret, supporting one another in ways that couldn't easily be seen or controlled. These weren't dramatic acts, but they mattered, because they preserved identity. They reminded people of who they were before everything changed. At the same time, there were moments when resistance became visible. Tensions built, frustrations grew, and occasionally small uprisings would emerge, quick, intense, and often risky, because the response from authority was rarely forgiving. Control had to be maintained, order had to be protected, and any sign of instability could not be ignored. So resistance became a balance. Too little and identity faded. Too much and the consequences could be severe. People learned to navigate that line carefully, to resist just enough to hold onto themselves, but not enough to lose everything. Because in conquered lands, survival wasn't just about adapting to power. It was about finding ways to quietly stand against it, even when no one else could see it. When history speaks of conquest, it often focuses on outcomes. Territories gained, empires expanded, victories recorded. But what those victories meant depends on where you stood. For the empire, conquest was success. For the people living in those lands, it was transformation. Not always immediate, not always visible, but lasting. Life didn't simply return to normal after armies moved through. A new reality took its place, one shaped by unfamiliar systems, new expectations, and constant adjustment. Some adapted quickly, others struggled quietly, but no one remained untouched, because conquest didn't just change who ruled. It changed how people lived, what they believed, how they saw themselves, and in many cases what they could openly remember. Over time, these changes became part of everyday life. Generations grew up knowing only the system that replaced what came before. And slowly, the past faded. Not completely, but enough that it became harder to recognize what had been lost. This is the part of conquest that history doesn't always